Imagine waking up to news that shatters every assumption you've held about American naval supremacy. A Venezuelan warship, yes, Venezuelan, has reportedly rammed a US Navy destroyer in what appears to be a calculated act of aggression that nobody saw coming. This isn't some third world speedboat we're talking about. This is a state sanctioned military vessel striking the most powerful navy on earth, and the silence from Washington is deafening. Now, before we dismiss this as another isolated incident in the Caribbean, we need to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Venezuela, a nation we've spent decades trying to isolate, sanction, and regime change into submission, just threw down a gauntlet that changes everything. This ramming attack isn't just about damaged steel or injured sailors. It's a direct challenge to the entire architecture of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The timing couldn't be more revealing. As the United States hemorrhages resources and credibility in Ukraine and the Middle East, nations like Venezuela are testing our resolve where we've always claimed absolute dominance, our own backyard. This is what imperial overreach looks like when it meets reality. The question isn't just what happened, it's what this tells us about the rapidly shifting balance of global power that our media refuses to acknowledge. Let's talk about what nobody in the mainstream media wants to address right now. We're living through one of those historical moments that future generations will look back on and ask themselves how we could have been so blind to what was actually happening. The Venezuelan ramming of a US Navy destroyer isn't just some freak accident or a rogue captain having a bad day. This is a calculated geopolitical statement, and if we don't understand the context surrounding it, we're going to miss the entire point of what's unfolding in real time across the global chessboard. For decades, the United States has operated under a very specific assumption about its place in the world. We've believed almost religiously that American military power is so overwhelming, so technologically superior, and so globally dominant that no nation in their right mind would dare to directly challenge us. This belief has shaped everything from our foreign policy to our military deployments to the way we conduct diplomacy. We've become accustomed to issuing ultimatums, imposing sanctions, and expecting the rest of the world to fall in line. Venezuela was supposed to be one of those countries that simply accepted its place in the American sphere of influence, no matter how much we squeezed them economically or politically. But something fundamental has changed in the international order, and this ramming incident is just one symptom of a much larger disease that's eating away at American hegemony. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has been surviving under some of the most punishing economic sanctions ever imposed on any nation in modern history. We've frozen their assets, banned their oil exports, recognized opposition leaders as the legitimate government, and done everything short of a full military invasion to bring about regime change in Caracas. And yet here we are, with Venezuela not only surviving, but now actively confronting American naval power in what can only be described as an act of defiance that would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. The question we need to ask ourselves is not just what happened during this ramming incident, but why it happened now. What has changed in the global power structure that makes a nation like Venezuela feel confident enough to strike an American destroyer? The answer lies in understanding the broader realignment that's taking place across the entire planet. We're witnessing the collapse of the unipolar world order that America has dominated since the end of the Cold War, and the emergence of a multipolar system where regional powers feel emboldened to challenge American dictates in ways that would have been suicidal just a generation ago. Venezuela didn't wake up one morning and decide to pick a fight with the United States Navy out of nowhere. This ramming attack is the culmination of years of strategic planning, alliance building, and careful calculation about how far they could push without triggering a full-scale military response. And here's the uncomfortable truth that Washington doesn't want to admit. They're probably right in their calculations. The United States is stretched so thin right now, so overcommitted in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Pacific, that our ability to project power in Latin America has been severely compromised. Venezuela knows this, Russia knows this, China knows this, and increasingly the entire world is beginning to understand that American military dominance is not what it used to be. Think about the strategic context for a moment. Venezuela has been building closer ties with Russia and China for over a decade now. They've allowed Russian military advisors into the country. They've purchased weapon systems from Moscow. They've signed economic agreements with Beijing that have helped them survive American sanctions. And they've positioned themselves as a key player in what's being called the new axis of resistance against Western hegemony. When a Venezuelan warship rams an American destroyer, they're not acting alone. They're acting with the tacit support of a much larger coalition of nations that are actively working to undermine American power wherever and whenever they can. Now let's talk about what this means for the Monroe Doctrine, that sacred principle of American foreign policy that has governed our relationship with Latin America for over 200 years. The Monroe Doctrine essentially declared the Western Hemisphere as America's exclusive sphere of influence, warning European powers and later any other nation to stay out of our backyard. For generations, this doctrine has been the foundation of American dominance in the region. We've intervened in countless Latin American countries, overthrown governments we didn't like, supported dictators who served our interests, and generally treated the entire hemisphere as our personal playground. Venezuela's actions represent a direct challenge to this entire framework, and the fact that they feel confident enough to make such a challenge tells us everything we need to know about the current state of American power. The ramming incident also exposes something even more troubling about the current state of American naval operations. How does a Venezuelan warship get close enough to a US Navy destroyer to actually ram it? Where were the defensive systems? Where was the situational awareness? Where were the protocols that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of incident from happening? These are questions that should be keeping Pentagon officials up at night because they suggest a level of complacency or technological vulnerability that nobody wants to acknowledge publicly. If a Venezuelan vessel can ram an American destroyer, what does that say about our ability to defend against more sophisticated adversaries like China or Russia in a real conflict? But the implications go far beyond just naval tactics and defensive procedures. This incident is a reflection of a much deeper rot in American strategic thinking. For too long, we've relied on the assumption that our military superiority would always be enough to deter any potential adversary from even thinking about challenging us directly. We've neglected the diplomatic relationships that might have prevented this kind of confrontation in the first place. We've pursued regime change operations that have only strengthened the resolve of governments like Venezuela to resist American pressure. We've imposed sanctions that have caused immense suffering among civilian populations while doing very little to actually change the behavior of the governments we're targeting. And now we're reaping the consequences of those failed policies. Venezuela's economy has been devastated by American sanctions. There's no denying that. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. Inflation has spiraled out of control, and basic necessities have become luxuries for ordinary people. But here's what the sanctions haven't done. They haven't removed Maduro from power. They haven't caused a popular uprising that brings a pro-American government to Caracas. And they haven't made Venezuela more compliant with American demands. Instead, they've pushed Venezuela deeper into the arms of Russia and China. They've created a siege mentality that actually strengthens government control. And they've given Maduro a perfect scapegoat to blame for all of the country's economic problems. From a purely strategic perspective, the sanctions regime has been an abject failure that has achieved none of its stated objectives while creating new problems that we're now having to deal with. The ramming of the American destroyer is Venezuela's way of saying that they're done playing by America's rules. They're done accepting their assigned role in the international order. They're done pretending that American power is still absolute and unchallengeable. And most importantly, they're signaling to the rest of the world that resistance is possible, that American military might can be confronted, and that the consequences of such confrontation might not be as severe as everyone has been led to believe. This is an incredibly dangerous message from Washington's perspective because it invites other nations to test American resolve in similar ways. Now, let's consider the broader implications for American credibility around the world. When a relatively minor military power like Venezuela can ram one of our destroyers without facing immediate and overwhelming retaliation, what message does that send to our adversaries? What does it tell Iran about the risks of confronting American naval forces in the Persian Gulf? What does it tell China about the potential consequences of more aggressive actions in the South China Sea? What does it tell Russia about American willingness to defend our stated red lines? The answer is that it tells them American deterrence is weakening, that our threats are increasingly hollow, and that the window of opportunity to challenge American power is opening wider with each passing day. The silence from Washington in the immediate aftermath of this ramming incident is perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire affair. In previous eras, an attack on American military forces would have triggered an immediate and decisive response. There would be presidential addresses, emergency Security Council meetings, carrier strike groups moving into position, and a clear demonstration that such actions would not be tolerated under any circumstances. But what have we seen so far? Muted statements, bureaucratic investigations, and a general reluctance to escalate the situation. This isn't necessarily because American leaders are weak or indecisive, though that may be part of it. It's because they understand, perhaps better than the general public, that America's options for response are far more limited than they used to be. Think about what a military response to Venezuela would actually look like in practical terms. We could launch airstrikes against Venezuelan military targets, but that would likely escalate into a broader conflict that could draw in Russian and Chinese support for Caracas. We could impose even more severe sanctions, but we've already sanctioned Venezuela to the point where additional economic pressure would have minimal impact. We could send more naval forces to the region, but that would require pulling assets from other theaters where they're already needed. We could support opposition groups inside Venezuela more openly, but our track record with regime change operations in recent years has been disastrous, and there's no guarantee of success. In other words, every option on the table comes with significant risks and uncertain outcomes, which explains the hesitancy we're seeing from American leadership. This hesitancy is not lost on the rest of the world. When America fails to respond decisively to a direct military challenge, it sends a signal that resonates far beyond the immediate incident. It tells our allies that American security guarantees might not be as reliable as they thought. It tells our adversaries that there's room to maneuver and push boundaries without facing unacceptable consequences. And it tells neutral nations that the American-led international order is no longer the only game in town, that there are alternative power structures emerging that might offer better deals or more favorable terms. The Venezuelan ramming incident also needs to be understood in the context of the broader economic warfare that's been playing out between the West and the rest of the world. The weaponization of the dollar, the use of the SWIFT financial system as a tool of coercion, the freezing of foreign reserves, and the imposition of extraterritorial sanctions have all contributed to a growing backlash against American economic hegemony. Nations around the world have been watching as America uses its control over the global financial system to punish countries that don't toe the line, and they've been quietly working to create alternative systems that would reduce their vulnerability to American economic pressure. Venezuela has been at the forefront of these efforts, working with China and Russia to develop payment systems that bypass the dollar, trading oil in currencies other than dollars, and generally trying to insulate themselves from American financial coercion. The ramming of the destroyer can be seen as an extension of this economic warfare into the military domain. Venezuela is essentially saying that if America is going to use every tool at its disposal to strangle the Venezuelan economy, then Venezuela is willing to use every tool at its disposal to challenge American military dominance. This is a fundamental shift in how smaller nations are thinking about their relationship with American power, and it represents a much more dangerous world for American interests than what we've become accustomed to over the past few decades. We also need to talk about the role that domestic politics plays in all of this. America is more divided now than at any point since the Civil War, and this internal division weakens our ability to project power abroad. Our adversaries can see the dysfunction in Washington, they can see the partisan gridlock, they can see the social unrest, and they can see the declining faith in American institutions. All of this emboldens them to take risks that they might not have taken during periods of greater American unity and strength. Venezuela's decision to ram an American destroyer was almost certainly influenced by their assessment of American domestic weakness and their calculation that the United States is in no position to mount a serious response given all of the other challenges we're currently facing. The media coverage of this incident, or rather the lack thereof, is also revealing. In a previous era, the ramming of an American destroyer would have dominated headlines for weeks, with wall-to-wall coverage analyzing every aspect of the incident and its implications. But in our current fragmented media environment, where attention spans are measured in hours rather than days, this story will likely fade from public consciousness long before any meaningful conclusions are drawn or policy changes are implemented. This media amnesia works to the advantage of countries like Venezuela, because it means they can take aggressive actions without facing sustained public pressure for accountability or retaliation. Looking ahead, the Venezuelan ramming incident should serve as a wake-up call about the changing nature of global power dynamics, but it almost certainly won't. Washington will likely respond with more of the same failed policies that got us into this mess in the first place. There will be calls for tougher sanctions, more aggressive military posturing, and renewed regime change efforts, all of which will probably fail just as they've failed in the past. What we won't see is any serious reflection on whether our entire approach to countries like Venezuela has been fundamentally flawed from the beginning, whether the unipolar moment was always destined to be temporary, and whether we need to develop new strategies for operating in a multipolar world where American power is contested at every turn. The truth that nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge is that the American empire is in decline, and incidents like this Venezuelan ramming are just symptoms of that decline. Empires don't collapse overnight in dramatic fashion. They decay gradually through 1,000 small defeats, 1,000 challenges left unanswered, 1,000 assumptions about power and dominance that turn out to be wrong. The ramming of a US Navy destroyer by a Venezuelan warship will probably be forgotten by most Americans within days or weeks, but historians looking back on this period will likely see it as one of many indicators that the American century was coming to an end and that a new international order was being born in its place.